From failed coup attempts to political purges to an economy at the crossroads, understanding the news out of Turkey is no easy feat. That's why I caught up with Christian Hanelt, a Middle East expert for the Bertelsmann Stiftung. As you know, the title of our program is The Crossroads. Turkey is very famously at a geographic crossroads. Is it now also at a democratic crossroads?
Turkey is a regional power, and it's really at a geographic crossroads, between Europe, West Asia, and the Middle East. And this is why it's so important for the West, and especially the US, that Turkey is, because of this geographic position, in NATO. Over centuries, Turkey had the only direct border between Turkey and Russia. So even if there were military coups in the past, the West has been sticking that Turkey remains in NATO because of its geographical position as a regional power. Turkey at democratic crossroads, I think, in my observations, my visits in Turkey, also the talk with my Turkish friends, my observation is that Turkey has already crossed democratic crossroads. It's already very strongly on a way towards a presidential dictatorship. The transformation from a parliamentary system to a very strong presidential system has been going on now since 3 years, and we are very strongly at the fourth end of that development.
Now, when AKP party, or the AK party, first came on the scene, and when we first had Prime Minister Erdoğan, there was a lot of excitement in the West that this could be a model for democracy in the region. Do you think that that excitement was misguided, or did Erdoğan change over the last decade plus?
There is no misguidance or misperception when AKP came into power by democratic means and elections. I think it has a lot to do with the personal development of Erdoğan himself. Erdoğan was the first mayor of Istanbul who brought electricity and water to all parts of the city. He was accountable, he was seen as non-corrupt. His personal political development and all the parliamentary victories of his AKP party, the Islamic Party, was basically mainly based on the economic development of the country. That means if there's economic growth, the party was winning. If there's economic turbulences like now, also the political situation is under turbulences.
Why do you think he changed? I mean, you're right, he built this coalition of these, whether you call it Islamic Calvinists, as I've heard it said, or the Anatolian Tigers, but that he was accountable, he represented broader Anatolia, and he was good for business. What was the change? Why change that winning strategy?
Two levels of developments. The first level is there's a strong socio-cultural change in the country in the last 5 to 10 years. When you travel through Turkey, on a lot of hills you find a mosque and a big Turkish flag, the same together. What does this signal? It signals to the visitor and to the population that Turkey is a strong national country, and its socio-cultural connection is with Sunni Islam. It also signals that the country has shifted away from a very elitary, Kemalistic, secular governance towards a stronger popular-based, very conservative part of the society, which is away from the big capitals. There has been a social shift that has also to do that richness, the economic growth. A lot of parts of the normal people have been profiting from that. When I first went by car at the Turkish Riviera in the mid-80s, there was no hotel. There was nothing. Now, there's one big hotel after the other. There's construction, there's motorway, there is airports. All these big national projects have been brought a lot of growth, have been brought jobs and good wages to a lot of people, and they rewarded it in the elections. All of that changed while AKP lost the elections in June 2014. when they lost the majority and when there was the question, will there be a coalition with another party, coalition government? Or is it going to dissolve again the parliament and have re-elections? And so the leadership of the AKP and Erdogan himself decided, no, we do not want to make the share of power. We go the majority way. That means, majority is we decide it all. So no compromise. That means dissolve parliament, make new elections, and at the same time stop the peace process with the Kurds and diminish and marginalize the political Kurdish representation, and radicalize, and help to radicalize the Kurdish militia of the so-called PKK.
Well, no, I mean, I think you make a very important point that there was obviously that crucial period between the two elections and where we also saw the deterioration of the peace process with the PKK. And I'm curious, if we look at the broader quote-unquote Kurdish question, which has been an Achilles heel for Turkey for some decades, if not longer, is there a way out of this complication, or is this only getting worse as Erdogan continues to consolidate power in Ankara?
Look, 20 million Kurds are living in the whole Middle East. Most of them in Turkey. There are a lot of them living in Iraq, in Iran, and in Syria. And they have a very strong external communities in the US and in Europe. There will be the Kurdish question will stay on the table. And there will be no solution to the Kurdish question through negotiations and a political settlement. And as I told you, as the Kurdish question is not just linked to Turkey, but also to Iran, Iraq, Syria, and when you see the wars and conflicts there in the region, this can only be solved in a context or in a framework of a so-called, of a system of conference of security and cooperation between all these regional powers, where also the Kurdish question is on the table. The Kurds, and it cannot be suppressed. They will want to have sorts of statehood or autonomy. And unfortunately, in the last years, the main driver of Erdogan's foreign policy in the region is to prevent any form of Kurdish statehood or autonomy which goes beyond the Kurdish autonomous area in northern Iraq.
So this is basically a square peg in a round hole. Is there any way to resolve this inherent conflict between a desire for autonomy versus a concentration of power that does not end in violence?
The problem is the perception. When you ask a lot of Turkish friends, why was there the breakdown of the peace process between the Kurds and the Turkish government? And then some of my Turkish friends tell me, the PKK used the time of negotiations while buying weapons in order to prepare themselves for another war. And the Kurdish friends tell me, the peace process was only for public relations. In the end of the day, it's really, the nationalist Turkish identity is the one, and we are excluded even from autonomy. And because of the big number, there has to be some sort of settlement. I cannot believe, it's a very costly war that's happening in the southern eastern part of Turkey, in the Kurdish areas, which is closely linked to places where all the Syrian refugees are. And it's also costly because, the Turkish army is now active in northern Iraq and in Syria, which is also costly because they want to prevent a Kurdish statehood in northern Syria, that it is really a mess and it has to be solved politically. But until the moment that Erdogan does not realize economic benefit, I think he will not change his very strong anti-Kurdish policy in the region.
Now I just have two more questions from you. In the first one, I'd like to move from the Middle East and look towards Europe. What policy approach do you think the European Union, what could maximize the benefits of the relationship between Turkey and the EU? And what do you feel about for years people have talked about maybe Turkey joins the EU. That obviously has become much less likely, and some people even suggest that this is a reason why Erdogan has turned away from Europe. Do you buy into that? What's your perspective on that relationship?
Because of the geographic crossroads importance of Turkey and also Greece, it was mainly the US that has been pushing Europe, or West Europe, the old European Union, in the 60s and the 70s, to put Turkey on the list of accession states, because they wanted not only militarily to bound Turkey to the West, but also economically and politically. This is why Turkey came on the agenda of being an accession state. The problem is that in the EU, Turkey is a big country. If it's also like the Ukraine, they are big countries. If they are becoming members of the EU, they will have a big share of political influence. That means it strongly alternates the character of the EU. So people are a lot of fear. Then suddenly Islam comes on the agenda of the EU, the identity question. So the desire of Turkey and also Ukraine to enter the EU puts on the European agenda the question of identity and the question, where are our borders? This is why it makes emotionally so difficult to just see the accession process of Turkey as a bureaucratic process. It has a lot to do with socio-cultural issues. But in the end of the day, it's better to have Turkey within the EU because of its big potential. So it's important to keep the accession negotiations open. It is important to start to open more chapters and to negotiate on that. I am convinced about that because my Turkish friends of the opposition and also those who have come now to Germany to ask for asylum because they are not allowed to work anymore in Turkey, they tell me, keep this door open because there will be time after that political turmoil for tomorrow. So we should keep that track open. And we have to realize that the European Union and Germany are in a big dilemma. We don't have a lot of tools to influence Turkey inner politically. Because we are not strong enough, we don't have developed a very coherent and strong foreign policy. And because we need Turkey. NATO needs Turkey. Now, fight against the so-called Islamic State, to bring peace and make an order in Syria, in Iraq, on the Balkans, to deal with the refugee issue. There we need a track, to communicate with Turkey. And it's member of NATO, so it's very complicated. If we want to have an internal influence in Turkey on the governance of the AKP government, I think there are only two leverages we have. The one is if all governments of NATO, and especially the US there, are giving their strong political voice to some requirements we offer Ankara, then they might change their positions inner politically. And the second one is if Erdoğan and the AKP government feel that they have a financial advantage, then they will change their policies. Only then.
Last question for you. In a crossroads, there's obviously very many decision points and bumps in the road, and I think we can likely agree that Turkey hit a pretty big bump in the road on July 15th with the failed coup attempt. How do you think that affects an already tenuous political situation?
The failed military coup is very strongly connected with an increasing suspicion, in my observation, of Erdogan's analysis of the situation, what happened. And this has a lot to do with what happened in Egypt 2 years before. When the Muslim Brothers came to power in Egypt with President Morsi, it was strongly supported by Erdogan and the AKP. So Turkey has strongly supported Egypt in the transition process. And then there was the military coup in Egypt. President Sisi took over, President Morsi is in jail. From that point on, Erdogan, he's Islamic Sunni, that means ideologically closely to the Muslim Brothers. Strong suspicion of any powerhouse in Turkey which could push him away from power. Yeah? So this suspicion made him motivated to go on to work for a strong presidential system, That means to go away from inclusion to exclusion, exclude the youth protests first in the Gezi Park protest, then the moderate Kurdish and secular parties, journalists, civil society organizations, the business holdings that are linked to secular generals, very important. And thirdly, generals and leading figures in the secret service and in the military, which are not directly linked to him and his AKP party. And now finally, the brother fight between the Gülen movement and his way. It's important to understand that when Erdoğan and the AKP came to power by surprise, they didn't have a lot of civil servants and people who could help them to govern the country with their political conviction. So so Erdoğan made a sort like a relationship with the Gülen movement and the Mullah Gülen, who is now in the US. And with those civil servants, with the Gülen ideology, he could make his bureaucracy running. And both were profiting also economically. But then there was this brother twist, and in the break between these so-called ideological brothers, and Erdoğan asked the US strongly to deliver Gülen back to Turkey, and Washington is refusing. So the suspicion between Erdoğan and Washington is very high. The relationship is very, very difficult because Erdoğan thinks, what does Washington want with Gülen against me? There's suspicion number one. Suspicion number two, why is Washington so strongly supporting the Syrian Kurds, Is it against me or what is that? That's very bad. But there you see how strong the influence of the US is vis-à-vis Ankara, even more than the EU.
Well, there you have it. It's an incredibly complicated situation, so it's great to have the expertise of Dr. Christian Hanelt. Thank you so much for speaking with us.
It's a pleasure.